Members of the NDP are connecting for a virtual three-day convention. They'll be debating policies, but it's also about much more than that. An election could be called in the coming weeks, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh needs to prove to Canadians that he is ready.
We can show folks when it comes down to it, when people were down and out, having New Democrats elected made people better off. It meant millions of Canadians were better off. And I want to make that case to Canadians to let them know the Liberals weren't on their side. They weren't fighting for them. And the help that they got was because we were there to fight for them. And I hope we can gain their trust to continue to fight for the people.
Brad Lavigne is a former NDP National Campaign Director. Kiavash Najafi is a former aide to the late NDP MP Paul Dewar. And Kathleen Monk, the former Director of Communications to the late NDP leader Jack Layton. And Kathleen, let me start with you. What is a good headline coming out of this weekend's convention for the NDP?
Energy, enthusiasm. Jagmeet Singh defines himself as a leader that's fighting for Canadians, for average people, and will ensure that he's on the side of families in the next election if there has to be one. I mean, that's the headline. They want to contrast Singh against Trudeau, who happens to be having a convention the same weekend. And so the message really is the one that, frankly, Singh has been pushing for the entire pandemic, which is we're fighting for you. We're fighting for the sick days you need. We're fighting for the supports, financial and otherwise, you need because of the health concerns around the pandemic and the economic concerns that Canadians have faced. I think that actually it's not only just that political watchers like myself are excited that we're having this, double-header convention weekend. I think it's actually a real opportunity for New Democrats to contrast the differences between Liberals and New Democrats.
Kiavash, let me ask you, is that going to be enough? Is it enough to just say we've got your backs and to say, look at that our efforts have paid fruit in terms of some of the benefits that have come through in this pandemic? Is that enough for the NDP going into this next election?
Well, the fundamentals are strong for the NDP. You've got about 40% of the population that thinks highly of the NDP and is open to voting for it. What stands in their way of voting for the NDP are two things: fear of Conservatives and generally being okay with the Liberals. This doubleheader convention gives us the opportunity to contrast Jagmeet Singh with Justin Trudeau and show that a much better option is possible. And at the same time, as the Conservatives falter in the polls, I think that the Conservative bogeyman is disappearing, and the Liberals will have a hard time trying to rally that 40% behind them at a time that that 40% would be looking at the NDP as an actual option.
And Brad, I want to bring you in here because I want to talk about money. We've heard a lot in the last campaign about the party basically running out of money, having to mortgage its headquarters. It now says that it's going to be able to spend just on advertising what it did in the last campaign. And so the finances seem to be in better shape. How do you think that could change the way in which this next campaign is fought, whether it's this spring or this fall or whenever?
Well, I think having an adequate amount of money for the campaign is absolutely vital. I think it's task number one, because you could have all the great messages and all the great candidates, but if nobody hears your message and nobody sees your candidates, then people aren't going to see you as viable. And that's to build on Kathleen and Kiavash's points. Viability coming out of this convention is key. That is, the NDP can win in all corners of the country, and therefore you're not squandering your vote. If you like what the NDP has done in this minority parliament, that is, get the reliefs that Kathleen listed, the CERB, the level of supports that Canadians needed. Let's remember, if the Liberals had a majority during this pandemic, there would be no CERB, and many of the supports that millions of Canadians are relying on would not have happened. What Jagmeet Singh needs to do this weekend is pivot from that, translate that record over the last 13 months alone to say, here's what we could do if we had the keys to 24 Sussex and had reins on government. And that, I think, a lot of Canadians, particularly at this time, we've got a lot of uncertainty. They're going to need to know which party is on their side. And Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have shown in the last 13 months where they stand, because if it was just up to the Liberals, a lot of Canadians would have suffered a lot more during this pandemic.
But how do you make the average Canadian connect to that when the Liberals take those ideas and make them their own?
I think you point out, sorry, was that for me? I think you point out the inconsistency of the Liberals. They promised things like childcare since 1993. I think it was yesterday at the convention where the finance minister herself said the pandemic has now presented an opportunity around childcare. It's maybe created a epiphany, she said. Listen, any mother in Canada knows that we've needed, any father in Canada, excuse me, any person that's had a child knows that we've needed a childcare system in Canada for decades. And so if you want a government that is not just coming to the realization that we need things like childcare, that we need things like paid sick days, that we need robust social programs to ensure that no one is left behind, you have to choose the party that has always fought for those programs, and that's the New Democrats.
Brad, I want to talk to you just about national appeal here. Certainly the party says that it's going to try to appeal to Canadians coast to coast to coast, and yet seems clearly to be targeting those in British Columbia and Quebec. And I want to focus in on Quebec in particular when you have a resolution at this convention condemning Quebec's Bill 21. Jagmeet Singh on this program yesterday speaking about it, calling that bill discriminatory and wrong. How do you build in Quebec in the face of the party's losses in the last election and the resistance it faces now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, putting together the 2011 Jack Layton coalition in Quebec is no easy feat here, and there's no question. And it took Mr. Layton many elections in order to stitch that through. But I believe that the conditions for Quebecers to return in very large numbers to the NDP are very there. The conditions are all still there. All the reasons why Quebecers in the millions voted for the NDP in 2011 are still there today. Folks have turned to the bloc in the last two elections. Nothing's changed. People have given Justin Trudeau an opportunity, and I think that Jagmeet Singh can make the case that he has failed on that front. Mr. O'Toole, I don't believe, is going to make any inroads in the province of Quebec. What Quebecers, I think, need is to say, listen, you gave Mr. Trudeau a chance in 2015 and to a lesser extent 2019. Now, the things that he promised, the things that he committed to bringing, has he brought those about? Only with the NDP exercising its balance of power in this last minority parliament have Quebecers gotten the kinds of policies, the kinds of relief that they so desperately needed. Again, pivoting that to say, can you imagine what we could do to work together? Travailler ensemble was the 2011 slogan in Quebec. Let's work together. I submit that the exact same conditions exist today, even more so with the pandemic than they did 10 years ago.
Now, your message, of course, can get hijacked. We saw it with the Conservative convention a couple of weeks ago. The climate change is real. Or not real, or depending on the defeat of that resolution that came up from the grassroots of the party. The NDP now have a resolution that call for, amongst other things, abolishing the Canadian Armed Forces. Kiavash, what does that do for the average voter watching on the outside?
Again, I go back to the fact that unlike the Conservatives, the NDP does not need to change who we are fundamentally in order to appeal to the 40% of the population that's open to voting for us. The values and the policies apply to them. Of course, a convention is a democratic place. People can have debates on the fundamentals. We don't disagree with each other. There is no question for New Democrats that income inequality is something we need to address. There's no question for New Democrats that climate change is a reality we need to face. Having debates about how we address those things is perfectly democratic. What's important is, and I go back to the question you just asked, Brad, about Quebec. When you look at the Quebec numbers, especially among younger members, younger citizens in Quebec, you see a potential growth for the NDP, and you see that the campaign that the party released earlier this month, specifically in Quebec, calling on the youth to dare to vote for the kind of change that they want. That is exactly the kind of message that is going to appeal to people and move them away from Justin Trudeau and into the NDP camp.
Last question. This one's for all three of you. Just taking off your NDP hats for a moment. What is this party's biggest vulnerability? Same question that we've asked to the Liberals and the Conservatives. What would you say? Start with you, Kathleen.
I think that the party really needs to try to make another beachhead in Toronto. That's why we've sent Brad Lavigne to live now in Toronto, because he is responsible for delivering the 416.
He is the beachhead.
No pressure, Brad. No pressure. But no, we do really need to pick up. Sorry, we do need to pick up some of those seats back in Toronto area, in the greater GTA, in Ontario just generally. So I think that's where the party needs to focus in the next election. In addition to BC and Quebec and all the other ridings you mentioned, Saskatchewan, I can go on and on and on. But I think getting back to having that stronghold in the 416 is important.
Brad, party's biggest vulnerability right now?
I think it goes back to the point I raised at the beginning, and that's viability. Voters thinking that the NDP can't win here, and you've got both the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, as well as other parties, Bloc Québécois in Quebec, saying the NDP are no longer a threat here. People might take that and say, well, they can't win here. The NDP under Jagmeet Singh can win everywhere, and I think the vulnerability would be to fall in the trap that the NDP are not viable when they are.
Kiavash, last short word to you.
RuPaul says, if you don't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else? The same applies in politics. You have to present yourself as wanting to become the prime minister and believing that you can run this country well in order to win. That was the major change that Jack Layton made in 2008 and then in 2011. And I think Jagmeet Singh has gotten there. You can see the confidence, you can see the pep in his step, and we're going to see that coming out of this convention when the ads are released and the organization is showcased. People are going to look at the NDP as a viable option, and that's going to really energize both the base and that 40% population that is accessible to the party.
Many thanks to all three of you. Appreciate your time. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you.
You too.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.